Canon just announced their R5 and R6 new mirrorless cameras. Let's compare it to the Panasonic S1H and the upcoming Red Komodo. Just a brief little chat. Let's see if it's worth it getting the Canon cameras or if any of these other cameras have similar things to offer. So let's get started. So today, Canon finally announced the highly anticipated R5 and R6 model. Now, this is exciting for many reasons. I'm going to tell you why through my own use case and how I tend to use a camera and how I've gone through different cameras in the past and why I need certain features just to make my workflow a lot easier. Now, even before we get to the impressive features like 8K RAW recording, you necessarily don't need that. I feel there are some other specs that definitely make the camera a lot more useful, especially for what I do. So let's break it down simply according to specs and how they can help you just make better content. For example, the current Canon EOS R, which is their top of the line mirrorless camera, it has a few limitations that I was never really able to work around with as much as I wanted to. That's why I moved to a few different camera systems. So let's start. First, I like to do a lot of slow motion of computer parts and gear and things of that nature. And yeah, you can kind of do it with the previous generation, you know, the EOS R before the R5, but you're going to be in 1080p, which definitely affects the quality, especially if it's downsampled on YouTube or something like that. You don't get 4K 60p, which is sort of like the golden standard, at least for mirrorless cameras, of having sort of slow motion. You don't get any camera in-body image stabilization on the previous EOS R. You just have to kind of work with whatever the lens has, and there are some digital options for stabilization, but it's not the same as having it actually on the camera. So these things made me move over to using more of the Panasonic cameras. For example, right now I'm using the Panasonic S1H, and up until the moment that the Canon R5 was announced, it's basically the best mirrorless camera that you can get anywhere. It's really incredible. In fact, it's even approved to do Netflix original productions, which goes to tell you what sort of cinema grade qualities that it has, from time code to even an upcoming RAW that you can do with an external Atomos recorder. But the most important thing to me is that it does 4K 60p internal recording. So that means I can get all the slow motion footage that I want. It's going to look great. It's going to be 422 10-bit. I don't have to mess around with an Atomos recorder if I don't want to or something like that. And it has absolutely incredible in-body image stabilization, as well as if you pair it with a lens like I'm using now, the 24-105 Panasonic Lumix lens. You get dual stabilization, so as you're holding the camera, you don't even need a gimbal with this camera. It's so amazingly smooth. Not to mention that low light performance is incredible. It has a dual ISO of 640 or 4000, meaning that if you have to be in a darker condition or even with this f4 lens, you're going to be able to bump that ISO up without really reducing any of the quality. So that's definitely exceptional. Now, I couldn't do any of this with the EOS R. First of all, like we mentioned, there's no in-body stabilization. There's no 4K 60p. I couldn't do any of this with the Sony a7 III. As great as that camera is, it's still limited to 8-bit. It's definitely not on the same level. That camera does have in-body stabilization, but it doesn't have 4K 60. It doesn't have 10-bit. All things that sort of affect the final product. The only other camera that I liked aside from the S1H is going to be the GH5. Of course, the GH5 or GH5S, they have 4K 60p. You can use an Atomos recorder to get 10-bit and 4K 60p. That's also a fantastic camera. It's micro four thirds. I just prefer S1H just because I feel it's a little bit more powerful. It's basically like a GH5 to the max. It has all these extra features, really nice stuff for making content. It's overall a fantastic camera. And now with the Canon R5 being released, it definitely passes this in terms of specs. We're going to have to see video footage to see exactly how it looks, but I can imagine that 8K RAW, even though you're going to fill up a lot of memory cards with that, the CF Express memory cards, I think it has the potential to look really good. Canon colors have traditionally been great. They've had great images in their cameras, and with these type of specs, of course, you're going to get not only 4K 60p, you're also getting 4K 120p, so you're definitely going above and beyond what the S1H can do. So the Canon R5 at around the same price as the S1H as of today's video definitely has the guts to go up against the S1H, and of course it beats it on almost every single spec. We just have to see if the image quality is going to be comparable. Then it's just going to come down to the details like recording times and things like that. The S1H of course does 6K, and of course one of the biggest differences between something like the R5 and the S1H is that Canon's autofocus is far superior. As everybody knows, Panasonic's autofocus has definitely been pretty much the only weak point of a camera like this in the GH5. They've improved it with different firmware updates, but it doesn't hold a candle to the Sony system or Canon's new dual pixel autofocus, which is absolutely incredible. You can do that in 8K and 4K 120p. So definitely specs wise, including autofocus, image quality, in-body stabilization, the price is pretty much the same as the S1H is now. That camera just definitely seems more fully featured than the S1H. And of course, the EF and RF mount are going to be a lot more popular with more lens choices rather than the L mount, which doesn't have as many lenses out for it, even though of course you can also, use the MC21 Sigma adapter to put EF lenses on the S1H, but it's never the same as using like a native lens, which you get much better autofocus. So overall, while the S1H is still, and it's going to continue to be, a very capable camera. I mean, it does 6K, it's Netflix approved, so you can literally use it to shoot a Netflix original. It has great stabilization. The image quality is absolutely beautiful. It has all great video features. It's still going to continue to have all those things, even with the Canon R5. But of course, the Canon R5 is just the newer and more superior camera. Probably going to have to wait until Panasonic releases their next generation of cameras to see something that's going to be able to compete head-to-head or beat the R5. Of course, the S1H does have 6K RAW coming, supposed to be coming fairly soon, hopefully. That will help a little bit. At least you have a little bit more latitude when you're grading and things of that nature, but it's still not going to bring the S1H necessarily up to the spec of the Canon R5. But that still doesn't mean the S1H isn't a capable camera. It definitely is. We just have something with a little bit beefier specs on the block now, which is great for competition, as new cameras I think are going to get better and better. Now, to quickly compare two other cameras, of course we have the R6, which is going to be a good bit cheaper than the R5 if you don't need 8K RAW. That's also going to do 4K 60, but that's going to be just a 4K camera. Of course, that's still more than good enough. It's still doing log and it's still 10-bit. So the R6, for those that are on a little bit more of a budget, I think stands to be a pretty good choice compared to the R5. You got to remember, 8K RAW is great, but you're going to fill up a lot of very expensive memory cards, but you'll be more than good with, a 4K camera like the R6, and that seems to have some pretty incredible specs as well. I would basically just go based on your budget. I mean, if you can spring for the R5, you're going to get those extra features if you're doing a lot of video. If you're doing more photo stuff, probably the R6 is good enough at 20 megapixels compared to 45 on the R5, so I think it should be fine there. And lastly, another camera that's actually very interesting, that it has a couple of things in common with this R5. That's going to be Red's new Komodo camera. Now, this hasn't been officially released or anything like that. It's still in beta, but this camera shares a couple of things with Canon. For example, it's going to use the same RF mount, meaning that you can put the RF adapters on it. You can use EF lenses. Red has always used a lot of different EF mount cameras in the past, so this is no exception, but it's definitely really cool that it's going to have RF already embedded with it. So that means if you have an R5 as a second camera or an R6, you're going to be able to switch around those lenses a lot easier going forward in the future. And of course, the Red Komodo is also going to have autofocus, which, this being sort of a mini cinema camera, that's definitely very, very exciting. And while it doesn't do 8K RAW, it is going to do 6K, and that's going to be the Red RAW, which a lot of people consider one of the best type of codecs that you can work with. It's really nice to grade, so that's definitely a huge advantage. And of course, this camera originally was thought up as maybe like a crash camera or a secondary camera, but as it developed, it looks like a lot of people are going to want to use it as something like an A cam, just because it's going to have a beautiful image. It has a lot of great features, so I think a lot of people definitely will use it for that. Now, in no way does the Red Komodo really compete against the Canon R5, because they're really completely different cameras. I think the Komodo is going to be more for somebody who wants to use maybe that Red codec. Maybe they have other Red cameras they work with. It's going to be a little easier to match. Remember, it doesn't take photos like the R5 R5 does. It doesn't have in-body stabilization. It's a whole different type of camera pretty much. It's basically like a small cinema camera. Most likely it's going to have more dynamic range than the Canon EOS R5. For people who are professional filmmakers and things of that nature, having more dynamic range is going to be a big differentiating factor. Of course, the Komodo is also going to cost more than the R5, so it's not exactly comparable. So even though the Red Komodo and the R5 are completely different cameras, I don't think they compete with each other. I think it's more maybe somebody would have in conjunction if they're a professional. Of course, these are both expensive cameras, but compared to the other more expensive cinema cameras on the market, they're a relative bargain for what you get. So it's good to see that these cameras are getting much more capable and much cheaper. So to summarize, the Canon R5 looks to be an incredible high-bit camera, not only for photos, but of course with its really crazy video specs like 8K RAW. It does have some limitations with heat and timing, so really look into that to make sure it's going to fit your use case and whatever your workflow is. The only other camera that's mirrorless on the market, aside from the R6, that I think is even really on the same level or close to is going to be the Panasonic S1H. But of course, that's going to have some limitations with autofocus, and it's just not on the same level as the R5 spec-wise. So we're going to have to see how that plays out, but that's still a very capable camera. And then of course, we talked about the Red Komodo, which even though it shares a couple things like the RF mount with the R5, it's a completely different class of camera. I don't think you would compare them. They both do very different things. I think they're meant for different users and different audiences. The Red Komodo is going to be a very interesting and a very good camera as well, because like we mentioned, it's going to have that red codec, which looks amazing. It's very easy to work with. You can get some beautiful colors. So that's great news because more people are going to have more access to these powerful cameras. And that's great because these are tools to make art, and the better tools that you have, you're just going to be able to do things a lot easier, as well as develop your skills with these cameras that have all these cinema features nowadays. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next video.